reasons of accessibility as well, please raise your hand at the back if at any point any of us here needs to project their voice as well. I am Savitri Persad, and just a little brief introduction about me. I am a PhD candidate at York University, and my work engages with ideas around madness and mental health and wellness and disability. And some of the connections that I make in my own research are how madness is gendered and how it is also racially coded. Thinking through as well about the connections that are oftentimes made between spirit possession and ideas of mental illness, mental health, and madness. And so in Guyana in particular, where my work is based and focused, there are these idioms that sometimes come into play, such as, well, Jambi got them, or these ideas of a duffy, that interfere with one's sanity, with one's mental health, with ideas or conceptions of who is mad or who can be made mad. And so that has led to violence in the community, violence in particular against women who have been accused of possession after receiving mental health services and who have been beaten to death. And so that was what precipitated this work in having these conversations and making these connections about gender and disability and madness and class and how all of these things as well are race. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from in this discussion. And my work in the community is also highly informs this research. I have worked on the front lines in social services for over 10 years with disabled people. I myself identify as a disabled woman and a mad scholar. And so, you know, this panel and this space is meant to engage us in the various conversations around health and around stigma and around wellness. Just before I go about introducing our fantastic panelists here with us today, I quickly want to say that one of our presenters on this panel, Cheyenne Dorishaw, wanted to be here, but unfortunately she's unable to join us. Cheyenne is the founder and the executive director of Blitz, which is a New York City-based organization that provides holistic care to LGBTQ sex workers. So before we begin, I really want to acknowledge her contributions to the LGBTQ sex workers community in New York and all that she has done and her organization has done to facilitate safe spaces and to care for members of our community. So we have a phenomenal group of panelists here with us today. We have Dr. OmiSoore Dryden. Thank you for the correction. Adam Benn, Marcus Kissoon, and David Soomarie. And so I want first to give each panelist the opportunity to take a few minutes, tell us about what you do, what inspires your work, the intersections of your work, and then maybe we'll go about engaging in a few themes and take some questions from the audience as well. Okay, so please.
Hi, good morning. So my name is David D.K. Soomarie. I make a differentiation when I say D.K. and you'll understand why I say that in a while. I identify as queer and as HIV positive, and I'm just standing in this space today and to be able to say those words are very powerful and very affirming. Because for a long while I couldn't do that. I came from a space where I was judged and criticized and considered to be demon-possessed. When I heard you speak in your introduction, it reminded me of things that were said to me, that I was demon-possessed because I was gay, and further demon-possessed because I had HIV. So I had two spurts, whatever that means. And I think as part of my introduction, I was reflecting on how far I've come from. I started this work in 2008, and so today, this year, makes it 10 years of myself as an activist. But I started this work because I saw many of my friends back home die from these complications, and there was no reason for them to do that. There was free medication, there was support. Why were we losing them? And I felt it's because we did not challenge the stigma around HIV and what that looked like. And so I made a very personal decision to be out in my home country, Trinidad and Tobago, as someone living with HIV, and as well a gay man living with HIV. And that narrative, to tell that story at a time when there was a lot of discrimination, a lot of hate, is something that honestly took a lot. I did not estimate. I underestimated the response I would have gotten to me coming out publicly on both fronts. And I did it. And when I began, when I took over an organization in 2008, 2010, CARE, which was the first HIV organization, started initially by a group of 6 gay men way back in the 90s. I was dying, and in 2009, when I ended up becoming the coordinator of the organization, I was attacked online and being accused of this flamboyant, coolie, cross-dressing, high-heel wearing person who is now running CARE. It's interesting. And so I was attacked online virtually for who I was. And so I faced discrimination and faced stigma on various fronts. Also to say why I differentiated my name deliberately with my initials, because my father is also David Soomarie. My father is an evangelical minister. So we exist on different sides of the spectrum. I am the very outspoken gay man, HIV positive, and he is a very evangelical minister who wants to deliver my soul. And who still, every time I call him, it's conversations about the world is going to end. You need to give your life over to the Lord before it does. And I'm like, okay, I hear you. Let's change the conversation now. Because I used to go to church. I actually did at one point think that for me to stop dealing with my feelings of gayness and desire for men, and the shame that I felt as a result of it, I had to go to church. And I became an active member of the church. But it didn't save me, because here I am now. I was going to church, and part of my struggle was trying to maintain the Christian order of things, but at the same time trying not to be gay. And that was so hard, because you leave the church after crying, after praying to God about your sin, and desiring men at the same time, and became too much of a conflict for me. And I made a decision to not do that to myself, because I realized I was hating myself. So that's just a part of my journey, and thank you for this space.
Hi, my name is Benn. I work as the manager of LGBTQ community programs at Sherbourne Health. So for many years I've done a lot of work with youth, specifically with Black youth, working in a number of neighborhoods across the city, including downtown, Jane Finch, as well as the Scarborough and Malvern neighborhood where I come from. So I guess my involvement in this work comes primarily through my own experience. So I come from a West Indian background. My mom is from St. Vincent, my dad is from Guyana. And so growing up in that environment in Scarborough and trying to find community was a struggle in my younger years as well. And so when I was able to sort of move out, I did come out to my parents. I realized how important it was to try to create spaces and create communities as much as possible. I went to Catholic school, so I think that a big part of my coming out process was understanding who I was within that context, which took a lot of work and a lot of unpacking. but fortunately have been able to do and have been able to sort of sit with that part of myself. And I think also just my own journey in terms of my own mental health and working with young people and seeing how in our community, conversations around mental health are very difficult to have, or they need to happen in very different particular ways. So just really being committed to trying to find different ways to have some of those conversations. So yeah, looking forward to this panel and hearing more from the panelists and folks in the audience.
Okay, hi everyone. So my name is Kissoon. I'm from Trinidad, and I think what was amazing actually right now is Ryan and Mohammed. This is actually my first LGBT panel. Actually acknowledging the fact that I'm a gay man speaking on an LGBT panel. They're really so when they cross waters, things just happen. But where my work is situated is that I have been part of the women's movement for almost 10 years, where I've been working in sexual assault and child sexual abuse in Trinidad and Tobago and the region for that time. But just living, going to an all-boys school, being just in the Caribbean man in Trinidad, and being now this feminist activist, it allowed for men who subscribe to a particular type of masculinity, which is considered subordinate, was allowing them to come forward and telling me about their abuse. So where my work is situated now is actually looking at the intersections of Indianness, child sexual abuse, and disclosure. Right? I think something that I want to acknowledge is that I actually sit in a privileged position where I've not been a victim of child sexual abuse, and I'm using that privilege to help my brothers. Right? Also, I situate myself in an Indian space, and I need to acknowledge my subordination to other types of masculinity, interrogate that, and then when we interrogate that, we know what needs to be done to help men and boys who are affected by trauma, more so child sexual abuse. With that, I'm a postgrad student at the University of West Indies. I'm doing gender development studies, and I'm researching that actually in the intersections of Indianness, child sexual abuse and disclosure. And I'm doing a lot of work around that in the Caribbean. So that's basically where I'm situating myself on this panel. So thank you.
Good afternoon. So my name is Dr. OmiSoore Dryden. I was at the doctor because I think about the fact that I was able to secure my PhD largely because of my mother and people in my family, and so I say doctor often to acknowledge her and the ways in which she supported me and the work that I was able to do that she was unable to do. I also want to, so I start by calling ancestors, and so I start with my mother, Veronica Dryden, but I also want to think about the ancestors in our community, and so here I think of Jamaican, Canadian lesbian activist Sharona Hall, who I met soon after moving to Toronto from London, Ontario, which is where my parents brought me when we left Jamaica. London, Ontario. Where I grew up in a very tight-knit Jamaican community in London, Ontario. I also want to think about people who are still on this side of the veil doing amazing kind of work. Camille Orridge, Doug Stewart, Angela Robertson, the late Tammy Makeda Silvera, Dion Brand, and D.L. Faulkner, and of course Beverly Bain. And there's many of you whose names I've forgotten, but know that's just because I'm nervous and not because I don't respect your work. So my work is in blood and blood donation. It's in the conversations around what constitutes safe blood, who has safe blood, what do people look like who have safe blood. And according to Canadian Blood Services and a lot of blood donation systems across the globe, if you have safe blood, that means you're white and straight, and like straight and most vanilla in all of the ways. And that it also means that you've never ever had a same-sex relationship, or you've ever slept with anybody who's black. And this is what it means to have safe blood. What does it mean to have tainted blood? Well, it means that, in the 80s and 90s, it meant that you were Haitian, and from Haitian, and from Haiti and Haitian communities. It meant that you were African in its full sense, right? In all 54 countries, you were African, often spoken as if Africa's a country. But it also meant that you were black, and black in a way where geographic distinctions were meaningless. And so if you were black, it meant that you had tainted blood, and it meant that you were a vector and a carrier of HIV, and more specifically of AIDS. And so in doing this work, I also challenged the kinds of debates that happen in predominantly white, gay, LGBTQ organizations in Canada who claim that gay blood is actually really good blood, and that here we need to read gay blood as white once again, because these proponents often situate black people and black queer people as the vectors and carriers of HIV and AIDS. And so my work really takes up anti-black racism in these conversations, the way that anti-black racism positions black people, black Caribbean people, black Canadian people, black African people as being the cause of HIV and AIDS. And I also challenge these experiences around respectability. We heard a lot about that on the first panel, that we need to be respectable in a particular way, and then we'll be accepted and included in the larger society. And for me, I'm just like, that's bullshit. I am about the freakiest of the freaks. I'm about those who do work that's considered not respectable. Here I'm thinking about sex workers. And I'm also about people who have sex, and who have a lot of sex, and who really enjoy sex, and have sex with more than one person at the same time. With the lights on, or downstairs with the lights off. With the windows open, with the windows closed. But I say this because there's a way in which respectability in black communities and black Caribbean communities works to our detriment. And works to the kinds of challenges that we're experiencing around HIV transmission, and the stigma around AIDS. So I'll stop there.
So, thank you so much for sharing those bios and some of those experiences, how your work intersects and is entangled with some of these themes around health and wellness. And so the name of today's conference, Breaking Silences, is really such an apt one, because much of what our panelists have shared with us in terms of their experiences and their work, they take up issues, health challenges, whereby these issues have been so cloaked in silence. And so I also want to think about how we challenge that, and how the work that we've done, for the people that we've met, the clients that we've had, folks that come into the spaces that we facilitate and support, how are we breaking those silences? How are we breaking those stigmas and creating these spaces where we can not just live but thrive? So I'm going to just turn that over to the panelists.
So, part of my introduction, the MSM outreach coordinator of Black App, which is the Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention. And we mostly work with a lot of newcomers who are LGBT folks. And from what I work with, so one of the groups that I run is called Come Apart, which is an older group for over 29-year-old queer bi men. And from what a lot of stuff that we're unpacking in the group is about identity. You have folks from African communities who lived a particular suppressed life for so many years. And they come to a space and told, well, you're free, but they have no concept of what that freeness means. Because they've been so policed into particular behaviors, so they don't have a real sense of who am I as a gay man, who am I as a queer man in this space. And oftentimes, in our work with newcomers and our work with refugees, we often try to speed them through a process. It's like, file a claimant story, write your story, get through your hearing, get a case done, get a job, but we're not dealing with the really emotional issues that come with it. And I feel like that's a really strong case where we need to focus a lot more on helping these folks unpack their traumas and deal with their traumas that they come in with. Yeah?
I agree, just to echo that. So again, at Sherbourne Health Center, there's a group, Black Queer Youth, BQY, which is a group, again, that was founded in the early 2000s by queer women, Black queer women who saw that there was a space that was needed for Black queer youth. And again, I think it's an important space for having some of these conversations.
Was that Cassandra Lord?
Yeah.
She one of the...
Cassandra Lord is the lady, yes, but I don't know, is it Cassandra?
Cassandra.
Cassandra Lord, no. And Burma Benjamin was one as well. And who else? And Aurelia was involved in some capacity. Trevor Gray, Keith Cunningham, Lorelei King, and Elisa Hatton. So those are people that I can remember, the three of them have been attached, and I think it's important to sort of give names to those folks. But again, creating spaces where folks can have those conversations and find community. What was always interesting about BQY was when we tried to have conversations, I think, about mental health, because I think that often wasn't received. It was received in different ways, in terms of people being like, you know, we're fine, we don't need to talk about this, or like, my mental health is okay. And I think that when we approached it from the direction of wellness, it was something that was a little bit more easy to engage with. And I also think that this idea of mental health that we're often talking about is a Western Eurocentric idea of mental health. And so really in starting to have some of these conversations, it's really about how do we have these conversations within a Caribbean context, within a Black context, within an Indo-Caribbean context, whatever context you want to put on it. Because the way that it's being had in spaces where we're trying to seek out services isn't working for us. So often a lot of that work falls on these community agencies to do. But again, I think it's about trying to figure out what some of those models might look like.
So, like, thinking about intersections, especially within the Caribbean, I have to acknowledge the fact that Caribbean feminists and Caribbean queer scholarship actually contributed to us understanding these intersections that prevent people like ourselves who identify differently, coming forward. So we have to acknowledge the fact that, one, like for example, Patricia Muhammad tells us that even within feminism, Indianness is still considered a minority politics, right? Which can tell us so much, that the fact that Indian identities in comparison to post-colonial Eurocentric masculinities is subordinate, and those scholarships help us to understand what we really need to focus on, because we could just take surface ideas of how to treat persons, but without considering the intersections of persons, we can't move forward with a proper treatment, idea, prevention, all of this. What is also important to note is that issues situated around gender is just something that we live every day, especially in the Caribbean. It is so young in the Caribbean. The institute back home is like almost only 25 years old, and we still have problems, you know, theorizing the problems that exist within the community, because we don't have a greater maybe respect or interest in dismantling gender ideals. And in my work, we see like something as simple as homophobia preventing not just homosexual men, but heterosexual men from coming forward with their child sexual abuse. So in my research, out of 20 participants, I got 2 who were heterosexual to come forward. And the major ideas around not disclosing was homophobia and not being able to live up to the hegemonic, right? And when we dismantle that, right, we could see that it's not a pathologized mental health issue, but it's a social issue situated in the way that we expect, or we live, or we want people to live. So that's where that's why I believe we have to start when treating with stigma and mental health.
You know, I think about the work that Makeda and Sharona and Angela and Dion and others who were involved in, that were involved in when I first arrived in Toronto. And one of the things about working with them was working with other folks who were out and from the Caribbean and queer and doing political work. And we're very much situated in a practice of Black liberation, and one that meant having open conversations about a lot of things we may not necessarily be having in our own home. So, my work in HIV, if you will, comes through blood, as I said. And so it's interesting when I do this work, the way the types of conversations that get raised that are often whispered. And so again, that's about sex and the kind of sex that people are having, but also the kinds of misinformation that is being shared around the transmission of HIV, and the way that perpetuates and furthers transmission in our communities. And here I mean Black communities, because this is what I'm thinking about here. But then the other breach in the silence is the way in which anti-Black racism fuels the disproportionate amount of transmissions that happen in our community. So just to be clear, I'm not talking about anti-Black racism as an illness. I don't think anti-Black racism is something that can be cured. But I am talking about anti-Black racism as a political agenda that furthers not only our disenfranchisement, but also exasperates our death, okay? And so, briefly, when your blood agency cannot ask you honestly about the kind of sex that you're having, then the blood agency is implicated in the perpetuation of HIV and AIDS and the perpetuation of stigma around HIV and AIDS. So the blood agency is going to say to you, are you a man who has sex with a man? As opposed to saying, are you having unprotected anal and or vaginal sex? Then they are perpetuating the ways in which HIV continues to be transmitted in our communities. And if we, right, are unable to say, yes, I like raw sex. I like raw sex and chem sex. I like having sex in the morning, noon, and night. I like having sex, over there, over here. I'm a terrible poet. I know, right? I was trying something, it didn't. But what I'm trying to get at is so in the project that I'm working on a research project that looks at blood donation. And what continues to take me back are the conversations we are not having about our own wellness, but also how that translates with decision makers, so policy makers, the Health Canada, the Health Office, the Public Health Authority in Nova Scotia and Ontario, and these places. Their assumptions that by our very nature of being Black folks means that we are HIV positive and we are infecting the general public, which does not include Black people, right? To be very clear, right? The general public. The fact that these are the assumptions upon which they are making decisions about our health, we should be taking to the streets, right? Because and that is the kind of silence that my work is, and what I'm trying to break. Because it is not the state that will secure our health and well-being. It is not the state that will stop the transmission of HIV in our communities. We will do that, right? And that's not about decrim this or decrim that. It's about the kind of community and community labor and work that we are already involved with, right? So this work around sexual assault in the community, BQY, right? The Pepper Pot, like these works. That's not about the state. And so that's the kind of silence that I'm wanting us to be.
It seems like one common theme that has come out of how we break silences is this idea of meeting people where they are in order to challenge systems in creating those communities with the Pepperpot group that you talk about, in taking to the streets, the importance of protest, meeting with governments, and so on. And so I'm curious too about in meeting people where they are and challenging systems. So for example, when we talk about Eurocentrism, which is so pervasive when we think about diagnostic models, right, in mental health, in the way that mental health is done, which is oftentimes based on a very Eurocentric model, whereby folks are pathologized, and we also don't consider how those pathologizations and how those labels are coded in so many ways, how they are racially coded, how they are coded based on gender, how they are coded based on class. How, excuse me, I think too that it's important then to bring together strange bedfellows. So where I'm going with all of this is we also had we also briefly mentioned how folks might be comfortable in meeting in these spaces, but they also might be comfortable in talking to a religious leader, for example, right? So how do we bring in allies? How do we bring in strange bedfellows, or folks that we might think of as strange bedfellows, to tackle some of these issues that we've highlighted?
I'm going to change the order. Because you've gone first a couple of times. Yes. Thank you for going first. Strange bedfellows. I think that's all I've been saying. So, this project that I'm working on, and before the project's most forefront of my mind right now. It has actually had me in situations, talking with people I wouldn't necessarily spend time with. And part of that has resulted in me going back to church. And that's because I'm working with small communities, small Black communities who are organized around the church. It means it's also the space where I'm going to be finding folks who we may call queer, trans, lesbian, and gay. I'm going to find them in the church, surprisingly. But because the community is small, it's the church where the community is finding fellowship, right? And so it's been an interesting conversation to, again, return to the church and talk about HIV and AIDS with, religious leaders and community activists through this venue of the church. I'm not sure I'm doing it really well, but it is something that I believe someone was talking earlier about being in a situation where you're uncomfortable and having uncomfortable conversations. And so, as you already know, I'm really comfortable talking about sex, and I'm really uncomfortable about being in the church, and so I thought I'd just pair those two things. And it's okay, it's working, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out of these longer-term conversations. And as a scholar, I have looked at the literature that talks about having the church involved in health interventions, and especially having Black churches involved in health interventions. And some of that has helped offset some of the stigma around HIV, and a lot of it has actually perpetuated the stigma around HIV. So I'm still trying to figure out how we bring people who may be committed to opposite agendas in conversation with one another, especially when we continue to be marginalized within the margin and not supported in ways that I think we need to be supported. So, yeah.
Okay, so I believe anyone can be an ally. However, in order to be an ally, you have to be informed. And when we're working with issues of gender, like that is so valuable, that is so important, because they have to understand what they're doing. For example, working with my clientele, my population of men who are assaulted, it is the boys' club that perpetuates this idea of silence, or causes the silence within that community. So men, one, need to have the new narratives for sharing things like feels, right? Solidarity, including all men and all types of men and all experiences within their group without segregation, right? When men have that, allyship becomes easier, right? When men understand how they perpetuate homophobia, right? In the soca music, in the methods in which they, share porn, or the way that they segregate persons in terms of academia. Like, for example, me who went to high school, if you didn't do sciences, you weren't considered a man, right? For some of you who went to prestige schools in Trinidad, you know sciences is the prestige thing to be a man, because it takes you to medicine, it takes you to law, right? So when men who are the prime personalities for creating silences for both men and women in sexual assault issues, when they understand how their gender realities perpetuate that, then they become proper allies. But I believe anyone could be an ally. So that's the thing.
I believe it's very important, I think, to be in spaces that are heterosexual. So I guess similarly being in spaces like church spaces. I know that I continue to do work now in Catholic schools. And I think that it's really important to have that visibility of queerness in Catholic churches and in Catholic schools. And what I'm realizing is that in a lot of these spaces, that visibility is causing a change to happen. And the change might not be happening at a larger level, at a Vatican level, but individually within schools, we're starting to see GSAs pop up, more tolerant teachers and spaces, and like working at Sherbourne Health Center, knowing that the Catholic Church is doing a lot of good work in the community in terms of addressing homelessness and poverty. So I think that, again, just being visible in areas to start to bridge some of those bridges across. Another example I think is relevant. We're trying to do a mentoring project now for Black queer youth at Sherbourne Health Center. As part of this project, we're partnering with different agencies, Black Cat being one of them, the Black Creek Community Health Center, Taibu Community Health Center, and the Griffin Center. And the idea is that we want to try to create programming that's not just downtown-centric, but also out into different communities. But recognizing that if we want to create mentorship opportunities for Black queer youth and mentors, we're going to need a lot more mentors. And recognizing that mentors who are working with LGBTQ youth now, a lot of people in this room are already doing a lot of that work. So how are we going to ask them to now take on more work? So as part of that, we recognize that we're going to have to start doing work in those communities to find more mentors. And some of those mentors may not be LGBTQ. Some of those mentors may be heterosexual, but there's an opportunity for some of that bridge building and some of that learning to happen, and for us to maybe reconceptualize what mentoring actually looks like.
I'm glad I got to the last. I had some time to formulate my thoughts. I don't like strange bedfellows. I think I like to know my bedfellows. But on that note, so I was just reminded about a project that we did about 2 years ago, and we had to work with strange bedfellows, and there was these white cisgender folk, and we were working on a trans persons of color campaign, and they were coming in with their own perception. And it's always, I think, is a principle is to check your privilege. Like, check your privilege and check where you're coming from. And sometimes we need to hold our bedfellows accountable and say to them, like, listen, this is not going to work for our community. We know what works. We know our language, we know our history, we know our narratives. Stop trying to tell our stories for us. And I think that's one of the things that it took a lot of unpacking on their end for them to understand that you can't just come in and make assumptions of the trans community as this particular way. So that they had this particular perception that was brave to come out every day as trans. I'm like, no, that's not bravery. That's just living your life. You do it because you have to do it. There's nothing brave about that. So let's change the narrative. So we had to really constantly challenge their narratives and hold them accountable until we found a way to get the right tone of what we wanted at the end of the day. Yeah? And so it's to how we claim space one and take ownership of that space two. And those who come into our space, hold them responsible and accountable for the stories that they tell about us in our lives.
And just before we go into questions from the audience, I have a question about costs. So, particularly when we are engaging with these issues of health and wellness and social services and the services that we provide, cost and funding is always a sticking point. And so, in the political climate that we're currently in, with a rhetoric of neoliberalism, which is one that has come to be marked by policies of austerity, I'm thinking about the Caribbean. I'm thinking about current funding for social service programs to support the issues that we're discussing here on this panel. The funding has historically been abysmal, and it has not been a priority. And as a result, the not-for-profit sector has increasingly had to pick up government slack and has done so with minimal resources. I myself, having worked with grassroots women's organizations in Guyana, one in particular called Red Thread, it's astounding how much work this women's group does in the community with so little. In the province of Ontario, we've recently elected a conservative government that has slashed mental health funding, ended the Basic Income Project, repealed the progressive and updated sexual education curriculum in favor of an outdated and frankly backward 1998 curriculum, implemented a hiring freeze across the public service, including social services, and recently cut the number of elected representatives in the city of Toronto from 47 to 25. And so much more is to come. This government is really just in its infancy and has only been in power since July. And so with this question of costs, it must also be recognized that the cost of not doing this work, the cost of not funding this research, these initiatives, is actually much greater. And so how can we think about next steps in terms of tackling these ideas of austerity in this climate, and where funding is such an important aspect of the work that we do?
So with back home, seeing a part of like the rape crisis movement back home, I want to acknowledge the fact that funding, well, firstly, one of the research that is only about 10 years old back home shows the link between child sexual abuse and the implications for HIV. Now, there are implications for HIV based on gender and sexual expectations of persons. In the Caribbean, women are expected to have sexy bodies beyond Carnival Street, wine low, but still be modest. Whereby men are expected to be sexual prowls. They're expected to have as much sex as they can. So you can see how that becomes difficult and how that puts persons in a particular type of space, which puts them at risk for HIV. So there is a link between sexual assault and HIV, more so the intersections of gender, right? One thing that we also found is that men would do anything to get that recognition in the boys' club, even if it's forced sex, right? So that's something to acknowledge. However, in the NGO sector, in terms of funding, one, male rape is very, 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 very new in the Caribbean. Like globally, we have like 1 in 6. We have Male Survivors UK, which is putting male rape on the platform. More so, rape has always been in existence, right? Times of war, rites of passage, especially amongst men. However, NGOs, especially in the Caribbean, are not acknowledging men's vulnerabilities, right? Men don't acknowledge men's vulnerabilities, and as a result of that patriarchy, groups who may also be run by women, and we know women subscribe to patriarchal ideals, right, will also consider the fact that, it's a woman's issue, right? So what, for me, funding for that is not even in the equation. It's acknowledging that men can be victims and understanding that men could be victims and their vulnerability is what I am focusing on right now, because if we don't put that information out there, then we can't create the argument to get the funds, and we are nowhere close to even acknowledging funds for male rape, right? And male risk for HIV. So funds is something so new I need to think about, because I'm so trying to get people to think that men can be vulnerable, right? I'm challenging the idea that male rape defeminizes men. Right, you have to understand that we have to challenge that idea, right? It puts men in the position of being receivers of sex rather than doers of sex, and we know that soca music perpetuates that man behind, woman in front. We know that we put men in a particular position of power, and I'm nowhere close to asking for funds yet. I am just trying to create the information so that these rape crisis programs could include male vulnerability.
So I'm fairly new to Canada. I've only been here 2 years, so I can speak about back home in Trinidad. LGBT work is not funded in Trinidad and Tobago. Friends for Life, the organization that I am considered myself to be one of their sons of, they have no staff. They run from project to project. And so therefore, and they've been around for 29 years. And they were formed because people were dying of AIDS-related complications. So one day, Adam will be next to me, by next week we don't know what happened to Adam. So Friends for Life became Friends for Life. And that's the genesis of this organization. This organization is still standing today with no staff to support people. LGBT work is underfunded in Trinidad. HIV/AIDS work is not that well funded either, because I ran an HIV organization. And I know there were months where I was wondering whether I could have kept the doors of my organization open, because I had to keep begging my landlord for kind of giving me some kind of extension, because the government were not releasing funds. There was one point in time where we had a shortage of medication, and we was like, what is going on? The country has money, why is there a shortage of HIV medication? And they were blaming newcomers. They were blaming the Guyanese. And we said, no, it's not illegal immigrants. It is your problem. It is your leadership that's affecting the response. And so I could speak about those things and say that we really do have to figure out a way that we move out of our comfort zone and we begin to now rally ourselves as a community and break the silence and not work in silos, but figure out ways that we can come together to can actually move forward. I feel perhaps is one thing we can look at.
I think that one of the best things that sort of happened since this change in government has been our communities start to mobilize, start to come together. It's unfortunate that it took that in order for it to start to happen, but it makes me feel that, you know, although things might happen and change, that there will be supports for people who still need them. I think that for Sherbourne Health, BQI, I can't comment too much because we are provincially funded. And it was very interesting, in terms of the first part of the year with the government thinking that it probably will fall, how money was spent, and now sort of moving in another direction and reading about deficits and wondering what's going to happen coming down the line. But I think just remembering that a lot of these programs that were in not-for-profits started as community programs, started with community activism. And communities are what supported it and created these spaces. And often when they're brought into the nonprofits, they're sometimes left. And they don't necessarily receive that community support. And I'm just sort of putting it out there to remember that, we do need people to continue engaging. It doesn't always have to be money. It could be labor. It could be, just a card, a support, something to just remind people who are coming to the services or who do work in the services, that there's a community out there to support, especially during times like this where you're often wondering what might happen the next day in terms of your stability, of your job, but also the supports for the people that you work with. So I'm saying community comes first.
So I think there are a lot of costs. There's costs to our own health. There's costs to the ways in which we can even claim health and wellness in our own lives. And I don't mean in a Audre Lorde kind of way, but I mean like in a Audre Lorde political practice kind of way, right? It's not a meme, but a political practice, like a political way of thinking about Black liberation and transgressive Black politics. When I think about funding, I think about the ways in which in Canada that funding for HIV or funding for cancer or funding for hypertension is racially stratified. And so the AIDS Committee of Toronto, lots of funds. Black Cap, Women's Health, Women's Hands, maybe not so many funds. And certainly not enough funds, say, to start a new Black queer health organization, right? Like there's no funds for that. And so I think what happens is people, they hunker down and they're like, okay, how do we keep the organization running? And that means sometimes you make decisions that may not necessarily be the best for the community that you claim to serve, right? And then how do you even talk about those challenges if with organizations that are currently funded without being seen as being, mean and, spiteful or jealous. What you want to really do is think through differently how these organizations can better serve the communities they say they're supposed to be serving. And then when you think about the kind of research funds that are available, again, I'm a scholar and I'm a researcher, in those research funds, then in some ways you need to perpetuate the racist stereotypes around illness in Black people to get the research funds. And so it's about saying, no, I want to study that priority population of Black, gay, and bisexual men and how they won't comply with their medication and how they continue to perpetuate HIV and AIDS in the general population. And none of that is about saying, well, first of all, what the fuck? But none of that is about saying, that is not the conversation we need to have, right? That's not the sole conversation we need to have. So part of, the piece that I'm hoping to get out of my work is also, what does it mean to be Black and healthy? What does it mean to have Black health? And what does it mean to think about a black population that's not just 2% of the general population, but 100% of who we are? Right, so 100% of Black Canadians and Black Caribbean and Black African folks who are here in this diasporic space doing transgressive and liberatory things. And so if we want to think about funding and cost, the same situation was there with Kathleen Wynne. And the same situation was there with whoever was before her, Eris. And the same situation was there with Bob Ray. Now I'm aging myself, but I'm cute and I'm young. And I'm Black. But the same situation was there when people were like, we need money in order to be able to prove to you, the state, that we need this resource for our community while doing something really more transgressive, which is about how do we work towards our own liberation. And that's how we're going to launder the money you give us so that we can better support members of our community. But what's happening now is people are like, oh look, I got another really great grant, I'm not doing shit for the people in my community, right? And that is a cost, because the cost means that there are people in our community who are dying because they're not benefiting from the people who are getting these grants, right? And so I think we really need to think more critically, continue to think critically about what the cost is and all of the layers and the way that that cost works out. Because, some of us are doing that without a paycheck, and some of us are doing that, with a paycheck, and some of us are doing it while dealing with chronic illness, and some of us are doing it not being able to feed our families, and some of us are doing it in many other ways. And so I think we need to, A, again, read Audre Lorde. Again, go back to the Black, queer, Caribbean, feminist, warrior, lesbians, who really kind of set the ways in which we did this work. And continue to learn, continue to be committed to the possibility of failure because we're trying something that scares the shit out of us. That's it.
We go into questions from our audience. I really want to just thank Adam, Marcus, David, OmiSoore, Dr. OmiSoore, Dryden. Thank you so much for your contributions today, for sharing this space, for listing a ton of resources for us as well. I'm hoping that we can also list some of that those resources that were mentioned somewhere on the website, or kind of send that out to folks, or have a way folks who want to access this information that it's possible for them as well. So we're going to take some questions from the audience. Yasmeen is going to join us as well, so if you have any questions for her and that great community-based research initiative that was completed, opening up the floor for folks to ask some questions.
I'll start off. Regularly addressing HIV stigma. This is a general question to the group. If you could just identify, maybe talk about you equals you, and what that means for us as a Black community, and how that messaging was sent out, and how we have to review it and accept it into a cultural acceptance. For those who do not know, U equals U stands for undetectable equals untransmittable, and how that has affected us as a community.
Yeah, we're gonna take all the questions and then
something that I'm interested in is a starting point of looking at the impact of the transatlantic slave trade and intergenerational trauma when we're having conversations about our health and wellness. How do you think in your own practice you incorporate those histories and and ongoing processes as part of the work that you do?
Similar and related, I actually want to talk about the intergenerational trauma piece around a particularly heinous form of sexual violence, which is incest. And we haven't talked a lot about that I think as it pertains, incest is something that's in every culture, but particular to Afro-Caribbean cultures, I think that's an important part of the conversation and looking at ways to actually address it and how that feeds into this conversation about mental health and mental wellness and stigmatization as it relates to people coming out about sexual behaviors within families.
My comment is, first of all, thank you, our last presenter, Yasmeen. And I think in the first panel, there were so many academics, and in this panel, of course, academics again. And I think it's something we need to talk about is, because I do see academics as advocacy. That's personally for me, my intersection there with academics is it's my advocacy. And I think we need to talk more about how do we, especially persons who have certain spaces within institutions, how do we really move from, how do we start to value other forms of research? Because, that is such beautiful work you're doing with the actual people who are impacted, but we don't see that a lot. And I can tell you, I've gone to spaces where there's a tier of research, and that would be down on the level there. And we have to be honest about, we'll value that way down there, because it's a different way of telling a story. And I'm a part of academics and academia, and you sit down there and you listen to how it is valued, and you, as a person, you want to be a part of that work. But then you do understand that certain research is valued in different ways. So how do we really push to ensure that community-based research, practitioner-based research, action research, but really taking to the voices of the people is giving more value in academics, because it's not there yet. It's just not there yet. So I want to talk about that as
well. Yeah, and that's why when we did T-Love, we actually went on and talked to the women, and then we had this idea of talking about HIV, because we felt like that was the most thing that needed to be addressed. And then they were like, no, we want to talk about love. Nobody's loving us. How do we love ourselves? most of the women are newcomers, experiencing all that English is not clearly, in this Canadian context, and how do we access services, how do we be safe, how do we love each other, because there's so much push and pull, and that's the approach that we went. And like along the lines that you're saying, there's a lot of research done and it's presented, and, hardly anyone gets the effects of it.
Yeah.
So we really need to go back to like the real life experiences, talking to people on the ground, and really involving community if we're going to talk about community, and not just the money and and all that, which is really great. I mean, I've been on a lot of projects which we do, but we really want to make the effect and the change. Else it really, it doesn't fit, right?
It's hard for me to have multiple questions. I can only focus on a couple at the same time. But I know for the U equals U, like let me speak from my own experience. I think that there came a point in BQI where we stopped having as many conversations about HIV/AIDS, primarily because people were tired of talking about it. And so I think the climate changed in terms of how we approach HIV/AIDS, and when I think the topic was reintroduced, there was a bit of a backlash because things radically changed in the sense of PrEP and PEP and some of those things. My understanding is now, having those conversations, people are more open and willing to engage in it. So I think just the importance of having those conversations continually, just so that changes that are happening across the field are reflected and that people can sort of take the time to adjust to it. Because I know that for myself growing up, gay men would always say, you have to use a condom. If you don't use a condom, X, Y, Z. So it's very hard to sort of turn that around and sort of say, well, actually, this versus this, right? Because it's really challenging something that's been indoctrinated for a lot of gay men, trans-identified folks already. So it's like, how do we start to transform that? I think in terms of talking about trauma, it's just a very difficult conversation to have. I find that that's sort of the area that we have the most sort of resistance, especially when it's framed like that, trauma. I think people don't want to engage with it. It has to be framed in this sort of way of wellness, but it's not then easy to get to those deep-seated, deep-rooted issues unless you feel safe to have some of those conversations. I don't know if that answers the question, but sort of my thoughts.
In terms of U equals U, I think we have to ask ourselves who is telling the story and who is driving the narrative. It's really white cisgendered men, gay men, who are telling the story about U equals U, about PrEP, about PEP. That's the honesty. And if you look at every piece of communication I've seen about PrEP and PEP and U equals U, it's usually the white people that I'm seeing. I may see a token black guy, I may happen to see a brown person in there, but really it's not speaking to us. So what we need to talk about is making sure that we create the country-specific communication that speaks to our community when it comes to PrEP, PEP, and U equals U. There is a lot of stigma about those issues. I remember we have actually begun a research project at Black Cap on PrEP, and one of the things we realized very early is that people are thinking that PrEP is something that people who are HIV positive are using so that they don't have to disclose. And that's not reality, you understand? So there's a whole misconception around these three things. When it comes to trauma, when it comes to incest, when it comes to rape, when it comes to intergenerational issues, we don't create space for us to talk about these things. That's one. We go through our refugee process, and we have to go back and write our stories of trauma. And I remember having to go back into my childhood. I remember how I first knew I was gay, took all my childhood experiences as a gay man. And those are not pretty things to talk about. Those are horrific things to write about. And then my trauma is coming back up again as I'm writing my story. It took me 3 days, because I had to stop, take a break, bring back myself, ground myself, And then we have these psychiatric evaluations that you have to do, which really, to be honest, I don't know what the fuck there is about. It really is a check box. Do you do this? Yes, no. And at one point I was asking the person who's doing my psychiatric evaluation, I was like, are you going to probe me? Are you going to ask me anything further? I feel this is just a ticking box kind of situation. And so we bring up back our stories of trauma, and I left with it. And then told, go away. Congrats, welcome to Canada. But there is no space that we create for us to really dissect and unpack our issues around trauma. And we also come from a country, particularly from the Caribbean, where mental health has a stigma to it. In Trinidad, where you see you have a mental health issue, you're mad, and you go to St. Anne's. That's it. We don't know that depression is a mental health issue, anxiety is a mental health issue. We don't talk about these things. And we also don't look at the fact that people who come who are settling into country have to deal with the trauma of resettling. It is a trauma of losing your country, of losing your loved ones, the sense of loss that comes with that, and having to find a new community. And that's a whole lot of work that we really don't place a lot of emphasis on doing. And we need to start figuring out ways to do that.
I just want to share my experience in terms of how academia needs to evolve in order to create an understanding and intervention method. So for example, back at UWI, my program is interdisciplinary. And we know that activism has become both informal and a formal discipline. But you can't just do gender studies and not include it in some sort of active result, otherwise you're just publishing for publishing's sake, or you're just writing it and doing your research. I think research needs to be interdisciplinary, and I think feminist work and gender theories has allowed for us to, one, problematize things, and then allow that problem that has been formally researched, filtered into the community, so it's both, top down, bottom up kind of thing, where we take lived experiences, document it properly, analyze given the system that we live in, and then feed back into the community. And that is what feminism has been doing for a very, very, very long time, especially Caribbean feminism. That goes into the idea of now what incest and trauma looks like in the Caribbean. For example, Tobago has been a breeding ground for incest, given the slavery and the post-colonial idea of what Tobago was, right? We can't understand that in a single discipline, right? That type of incest needs to be interrogated interdisciplinary. Right? We need to understand the socio-economic disposition of women and mothers who allow family members to have sex with their children as a way of survival. And those things, we need to understand the negotiation process as well, right? So we do need to adapt an interdisciplinary methodology when problematizing, theorizing, and then solution-oriented.
So, all of my work, so I wanted to go back to the strange bedfellow thing. I'm the strange bedfellow in gay blood research. Like, I'm the strange one. Because I'm a black queer femme, and not a white gay man. And because central to my work in blood donation is the ways in which anti-black racism inform the deferral process, right? And the history of anti-black racism and blood donation in Canada. And so, and the way that has been, the way that kind of, the way that blood donation systems is another form of imperialism, because the World Health Organization, citing Canada as a good model, is insisting on using this model steeped in anti-black racism to set up national systems of blood donation in Nigeria, in Cameroon, in Chad, in the Caribbean, right? And so we see the ways this exportation of an imperial measure on blood donation. So all of that to say, to answer Ruth's question, is absolutely, my work absolutely takes up the transatlantic slavery, takes up the afterlife of slavery, and the ways in which anti-Blackness informs measures of health and wellness, illness, and transmissions of illness. Right? So for 20 years, Canadian Blood Services assumed that if you are Black, that you are a vector of disease, and therefore you should donate blood. Right? And this for me is into how we even understand homophobia in Canada. So if we come from many places across the Caribbean region and the continent of Africa, here to Canada, a lot of us pick up Canada, a lot of us don't. And the thing that I think that we need to address once we reach is the ways in which anti-Black racism impacts how we are perceived, how we are engaged, and the ways how we understand movement or progress or security and safety while we live. For Andrew's point, I don't believe that about academia. I come out of an academic practice where community was always central in my learning and in my research. If I was doing research, my research is not for research's sake, right? That's not how I was trained as a scholar, was to do research for research's sake. I think my role in our liberation as a scholar and as a researcher is about documenting, is about listening, is about theorizing the work. And I think that has use. That has use, right? I think of the work of Audre Lorde and the work of Dion Brand and the work of Bell Hooks, and we can think, Anna Ford Smith and many others who have published their work or shared their work with us, and that work is theory. I think about the kind of political activism that was happening in the Caribbean, and here I include Haiti and Cuba, the way that my parents talked to me about it, the way this activism happened in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, and to me that's theory, right? That is learning the way to think through how systems operate so that we can make different choices in order to disrupt those systems so we can live full lives, right? And so I don't see, when I see this breach between the academy and activism, or the academy and advocacy, or the academy and community, I see the white supremacy of those facts. But the kind of history of us and the academy, for me, is steeped in activism and liberation and transgressive practices. And so I don't see that separation. And so while I might be like, oh, homonationalisms and, transgressive practices and queer diasporic, blah, 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 because that's, I've been trained in that kind of language, right? That kind of language. For me, what I'm also speaking about, God, I wish I had more language. I also am thinking about this work that we are doing, right? And my role in this work is to really to offer it and perhaps say in a different space, right, for the same goal, which is liberation. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I want to thank our panelists today, and thank you so much, Yasmeen, for that presentation. And right now, we are going to break for lunch. So please